Hi, we move into 1 Samuel 25 today and the exciting story of David and Nabal and Abigail, which has layers upon layers and layers in it. And so as we begin to look at it, the first thing we're going to do is ask the question of what is it doing here in between the two stories of Saul chasing David around and David finding Saul first in a cave and then elsewhere in chapter 26. And eventually in both situations, Saul acknowledging that David is going to be king someday, and they go off. And in the middle is this story about a rich landowner with 3,000 sheep that David offers protection or extortion or something, we'll figure out, and ends up with his wife, Abigail, when it's done, and another wife too. So what is this story doing here? And as I've been saying since I did the introduction to these three chapters together, they're tightly connected. And we're going to begin by looking at some of the ways they're tightly connected, not only these three stories together, but 1 Samuel 25, two passages in Genesis about Laban and Jacob, but also connected to other passages about sheep shearing and other things. So once we get into the story, the textual intersections point in all kinds of different directions. And it's certainly one place where, despite my claim throughout this series that I'm trying to follow a story that I'm assuming among the ranges of possibilities that scholars have for when the story was written, that the rise of David took place roughly contemporaneous with David and Solomon to justify their acceding to being king. But these chapters may well have been written sometime later, perhaps from the time of exile, raising the question, as some scholars have, of whether these chapters are there to raise the question about whether monarchy itself is going to be an acceptable element. We saw in the last video a couple of hints of that. So we saw that David is quoting something which the NORSV called an ancient proverb, but the word we looked at could be an Eastern proverb, and that could be from Persia. And that would be the nation that defeated Babylon and ruled over the province of Yehud for a couple of centuries before the Greeks came along with Alexander the Great and his successors. So that would have been the post-exilic period of Ezra, Nehemiah, and others, and that's possibly one hint that's from that time period. In our chapter today, we'll see hints because the way that Nabal and Abigail are characterized right at the beginning echoes images from the book of Proverbs about wise or clever women and foolish men. And the Proverbs may have an oral history, as we can know in English in America. Many Proverbs, that some of which we think are in the Bible, like God helps those who help themselves, but that's from Ben Franklin, or cleanliness is next to godliness, which is from John Wesley. And we don't need to write those down to know them, or many other little Proverbs, whether those are ancient ones or more recent ones. So we don't know if the biblical Proverbs were a collection that were gathered from having been written or been treated orally for centuries earlier, but certainly the book of Proverbs is part of the wisdom literature from the exilic period. So to the extent that our story here knows some images from Proverbs, that's another evidence it may be late. But we can also read it in the direct context of the narrative we have here, although if we take these three chapters out, the story does seem to flow well. But that's not what the final editors did, so we're going to read it in this way. So let's look at some of those comparisons. As we've been saying, and I showed in the introductory video, and we'll look at it again now briefly, the verbal links between 1 Samuel 25 and 1 Samuel 24 and 26. So on the left side of the screen, going in sequence, is 1 Samuel 25. On the right side are various pieces from chapter 24 and 26, as you can see. And I want to focus now on the first parts, because we're just going to look at these first three verses today. The connection of Maon here, as you see on the left side in verse 2, which is never mentioned again, but we were told in chapter 23, just before this sequence, that David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, which is otherwise not relevant to that story particularly. We see today that Nabal has 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and we note at the beginning of chapter 4 that Saul had 3,000 chosen men, and David went into the direction of the rocks of the wild goats, or at least Saul looked for him there. And then they came to the sheepfolds beside the road, which has nothing to do with the story otherwise, and yet will connect with Nabal and his sheep. And then one more thing that we'll see here, he's described as a Calebite, which can mean either that he's a member of the tribe of Caleb or that he's a member of the tribe of dogs, because the word Caleb means dog, and it's certainly connected here with David saying to Saul, "Whom do you pursue? A dead dog," a Caleb. So there are those links there, and we'll be looking at those as we go. But there's also the verbal links here between this story and the Jacob and Laban story, and not least of which is that their names are the same but in reverse, both in English and in Hebrew. And we see the shearing of sheep here, and we'll see more connection to the shearing of sheep in a couple of minutes. And then the parallels with Abigail's description and Rachel's description using the Hebrew word Yapha there, although Rachel's described as graceful and Abigail's clever, so they're not exactly the same. But there are many, many connections there. And as we'll see later, and as I'm working my Genesis series to the other direction, the Jacob and Laban story itself might be seen overall as an allegory for the Davidic monarchy. So there are many connections back and forth. What might that mean here, since Genesis is certainly, in my reading of it, an exilic story? That's certainly more evidence here. If Samuel is taking up the story in Jacob and Laban in Genesis, but it might be the other way around. It might well be that the 1 Samuel 25 story does not know the Jacob and Laban story, but the Jacob and Laban authors know the story of Nabal and have shaped this story to match this one. And that would certainly make sense of more traditional understandings of the David story as being older. And I've certainly not been relying on the idea that the Deuteronomistic history knows Genesis, more the other way around, that Genesis knows Deuteronomistic history and builds some stories around little pieces like in Deuteronomy, but that's in my Genesis series. So with those various things in mind, let's begin to jump into our story, noting the key words that we see here throughout the story. Go back to the top here, and shearing and shearers is clearly one of those initial issues. But before we get there, we have to get to the first verse, which scholars can easily skip over, thinking the stories about David and Nabal and Abigail, because it tells us something very important here. Samuel died. And that's an interesting piece here, because we'll hear it again in the beginning of chapter 28. The same notice almost exactly. So Samuel died, and let's look at the rest of the verse, and then we'll go back and reflect on it. And all Israel assembled and mourned for him. We only have seen all Israel assembling earlier for Samuel, in chapter 7 at the beginning, and in chapter 8 around the question of a king. And then in 22 we see an assembly here, but this is people assembling around David. So all Israel is assembling only for the second time, both when Samuel first called them together and now at his death. We don't know what he died of, we don't know where he died, but we are told they mourned for him and buried him at his home in Ramah. The word for mourning here, Vaispadu li, can mean wail or lamented, and we'll see the same word around several others as we go. Mourning Samuel again, that's the verse in 28:3. We might as well look at that here, and you see it's the first part of it is very similar. The second part is added there, and so one can ask why that repeated notice, and we'll get back to that in a minute. And then we see about Saul and Jonathan, mourning Saul and Jonathan's death, Abner's death, and then Uriah's death. So those various mournings, along with the various burials. And we'll note that as 1 Samuel goes into 2 Samuel, the bodies start to pile up. And we see after Saul, Asahel, Abner, Ishbal, and Ahithophel, they're all being buried. And there are many other deaths where their burials are not described. So they bury Samuel at his home in Ramah. Literally, it describes in his house, and that's not like he would actually bury him in his house. But so Samuel is buried up here in Ramah, and David got up and went down to the wilderness of Paran, which isn't even on our map. Scholars say it's in the southwest of the Edom area, so somewhere here. He had been in En-gedi, and it had been described in the end of the last verse that he just went up to the strongholds, but it hadn't said where. So presumably the strongholds in En-gedi. So he's going the exact opposite direction. Did he participate in the mourning? Was he part of the all Israel that assembled and mourned for Samuel, who after all was his mentor and the person who anointed him as king in the name of Yahweh? And then we have to ask, does anybody besides Samuel and David know about that? With Samuel's death, has David lost, if not his protector, at least his supporter, the one who would claim if asked that yes, Yahweh has replaced Saul with David? So now David is on his own, and it's perhaps something like a parent dying, because we know nothing about his relationship with his father Jesse, who we only hear named, and he's never a character in the story. So just as Eli was sort of a father for Samuel in the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, therefore Samuel became at least a spiritual father for David in a little way, and now he's lost. So David has gone the opposite direction, and the story starts with this huge shift. There was a man in Maon whose property was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. And immediately his readers may ask, who are these people? Why do we need to know about this? And the last chapter and the last few chapters have all been about David and Saul, with Jonathan inserted a little bit in there, but there haven't been any other characters, and certainly not stories about other characters. So this really comes in as if it's an insertion and leaving readers with a certain suspense of when am I going to find out what this has to do with the Saul and David story. But as many scholars have noted, we can read this story, as Polzin does other stories, as an allegory, suggesting that Nabal is not a real person at all, that this is just a fictional character, whether just in the minds of the author or perhaps in the mind of a dream that Saul is having, because in chapter 26 we'll be told that the one thing that is actually attributed to Yahweh in these chapters is casting a deep sleep on Saul. So perhaps he's having this dream as part of his deep sleep, as Barbara Green suggests, although that's obviously speculation. But in whether it's a fictional story inserted here like a parable, or whether it's a historical story or not, it's an odd story here. And it's made even more odd, as we'll see in verse 3, which, not to have a spoiler alert to name it now, the main character's name, Nabal, means fool. And so who would be a landowner whose name is Fool in the real world? It can be a nickname, but plainly that's not a name you would claim. Although, interestingly, we only hear the narrator calling him that here. We don't ever hear the characters other than Abigail refer to him as that. So let's jump into this as we continue in verse 2. So there was a man in Maon, and notice that verse 2a in the Hebrew has no verbs. It's just simply the data. Man in Maon, property in Carmel. And literally, the word for property here, although this phrase is found 235 times in the Masoretic text, it's only a couple of times in Samuel. The phrase here is used otherwise as work or deeds rather than the physical thing like property. But what matters is that's where whether we call it his work, which is shearing the sheep, or property, it's that. And we don't hear that, interestingly, he owns the land. We hear that he has sheep and goats. We only presume that he owns the land that they're on, but we don't know that. And so that may be a factor here, although we have to assume that he is a wealthy landowner. And that brings up the role of landowners, which we'll look at in a minute in relation to kings. So he was described as very rich here, or literally a man of great power. It doesn't really say anything economically, just great power. And we'll see way later at the other end of 2 Samuel a character also described as that, with Barzillai, who, as Hamilton notes, is an alternative way of being an elite member of society. So one is like Nabal, who we'll see is described as surly and mean and his deeds are evil, and one like Barzillai, who's a faithful servant of David right up to the very end. So the 3,000 sheep, as we note, is parallel to Saul's 3,000 men that he comes chasing after David with. It's a huge number. This picture purports to be of 3,000 sheep. I'm not sure if anybody actually counted them, but 3,000 is a lot of sheep. And the 1,000 goats, who have almost nothing to do with the story other than the parallel that David went off to the rock of the wild goats. And he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. And as Geoghagan below, who wrote a nice article just about sheep shearing, he notes in all four stories, sheep shearing provides a setting for avenging a wrong. So let's look at these four scenes, and they're all related. These are the four sheep shearing scenes in the entire Bible, and they're all closely connected. Two are in Samuel, the one now, and the one with Absalom in 2 Samuel. One is about Laban, that we were just noting as parallel, and the other is about Judah and Tamar. But there's two different Tamars in the David story, David's daughter Tamar and Absalom's daughter Tamar. And in the Absalom situation down here, precisely what's at issue is Absalom seeking to get revenge for his half-brother Amnon here's rape of Absalom's full sister Tamar. So there's an implicit Tamar here, an explicit Tamar here, and the parallel here between Laban and Nabal, and between Rachel and Abigail. So all four of these stories could be coordinated, and we won't look at both Genesis stories or the Absalom story now, but we'll certainly look at this one later, and we'll look at these in our Genesis series. So the fact that he's shearing the sheep, and plainly it wouldn't mean literally he's doing it, it would be a whole team of people doing it, and it's a lot of work. Here's one image of a sheep being sheared, which is a little odd to my eyes because I've never done that. But it would mostly have been done in the field and taken a long time. So they would have had a party out there. It would have been an opportunity for feasting of all kinds, and associated with heavy drinking, which is a relevant aspect to this story, as we'll see. And there's drinking in other aspects of these things as well, including in the Absalom story here, where Absalom made a feast like a king's feast, echoing precisely what Nabal's feast is, where he gets drunk near the end of our story here. So lots and lots of parallels to be paying attention to. So going back to our key words as we get down to verse 3 now, and that's really all we're going to do today just to set this up. There's still plenty to look at in verse 3. Now the name of the man was Nabal, And notice the folkloric way this is being presented. Just as doesn't say, he could have said there was a man named Nabal in Maon. He's described here without a name, and now he's given a name, and the name simply means foolish. And Boyle argues for a stronger meaning as churl, and he says, the fool as Nabal was gravely defective. He acted with serious guilt with communal consequences. The root Nabal denoted the phenomenon of death for a human corpse before burial or for an animal that was ritually unclean. The verb also denoted the withering of plants. The notion of nebula was extinction, whether of human, animal, or vegetable life. The noun nebula involves sacrilege, so that the fool was an outcast. Really highlighting that the everyday English word fool, which you could take as just someone who's kind of silly or not sensible, doesn't nearly get to the negativity of what this name implies. And then we hear the name of his woman was Abigail here, meaning my father was delighted. She's the only Abigail in the Bible, but there's one close, and we need to look at that briefly in two forms to see what's going on here. So let's look at this in 2 Samuel 17, where we see Absalom had set Amasa over his army, and then Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. And so if we try to parse that out here, we can see, despite the spelling differences in the name, the Masoretic text is the same as the one in our text. And so no other Abigail is mentioned, and thus Halpern suggests that Yitra equals Nabal, and thus Amasa is son of Nabal and stepson of David. If we take that all literally. And that's an interesting thing, because we'll often hear of Zeruiah and the sons of Zeruiah, who's a woman, including of Joab, but we never hear openly of Joab's father. It's a very unusual thing to have three sons named by their mother. So that's one of the two links to look at. And the other one is in 1 Chronicles, which makes something else very specific. And although 1 Chronicles is certainly written later, and its factuality is questionable, it's certainly presenting something interesting into the story by telling us this. Their sisters were Zeruiah and Abigail, which is to say that both of those are sisters of David. If I go back up here, you can see that these are the children of Jesse and his wife, David the seventh, and then their sisters. So both Zeruiah and Abigail are both sisters of each other. That would make Abigail the aunt of Joab and Asahel and Abishai, the three sons of Zeruiah, and would make her a cousin, if I'm counting this right, you would make her a sister of David, which would make their union incestuous, echoing the incestuous union of Amnon and Tamar, although that's involuntarily via rape, and this is voluntarily, maybe, as we'll see at the end of the story. So one of the interesting things about that, though, is there's nothing in the story that says that when David meets Abigail, he goes, "Oh, Sister Abigail," or that she recognizes her brother David. So even though it's the only name and that's a possible inference, nothing in the story itself suggests that they've ever met before or they would know each other. So it's just an interesting tidbit in the background. So let's look more closely at how she's described, because both of these two words are important. She's described here in the Newer RSV as clever, tovas sekel, and the phrase is only here in the Masoretic text, but it's connected to the Proverbs. Let's look at it here in a key word. In 13:16, the clever do all things intelligently, but the fool displays folly. And that kind of parallel, separating wisdom and folly, or cleverness and folly, using just this word here, is a common proverbial contrast. Tov is from good, so literally means good understanding. And as Molzak notes, the only place in the Hebrew Bible where this term is used in relation to a woman. Sekal is used a number of times, and you see these uses in Proverbs. Let's look at 16:22 in particular here, where you see wisdom is a fountain of life to one who has it, but folly is the punishment of fools. And here using these two words, not using the traditional word for wisdom in Hebrew, but using this word here. So many ways that we might connect this, that these are characters representing the virtues of wisdom or cleverness and beauty versus folly. And the fact that she's described as beautiful brings up the question of beautiful people in the Bible. And what do you know? A lot of them are in Genesis or in the books of Samuel, again, closely connected. I won't go through all of these, but just to note the connections we see here. The one about Abram and Sarai is important because Later, there's also the connection that we saw when David challenged Saul in the last scene, may Yahweh judge between us, that Sarai said the same thing to Abram in chapter 16 in Genesis over the Hagar situation. So there's that echo as well, as that Sarai is also seen from Abram's perspective as beautiful. And then we already saw Rachel, but also Joseph, and I've color-coded these in a sort of traditional way with the women's as pink and the boys, if you will, as blue, but to highlight that it's not only women who are described as beautiful. We don't usually in English and our culture here in the United States think of men as being beautiful, and the text sometimes uses handsome like we see here, but it's the same word yapa in all these situations. So Joseph was beautiful, and then David was beautiful, and we're told that twice. When the Philistines saw he was beautiful, they disdained him, thinking he's a pretty boy, he's not a warrior. And one of the questions that some scholars have asked is beauty meant to be a divine attribute, or is it a distraction? And what elements of beauty are important, and we'll look at that again in a minute. Abigail, as we see, is clever and beautiful, and as I was already hinting at, Absalom had a beautiful sister whose name is Tamar, but he also has a beautiful daughter whose name is Tamar. And then finally, David gets a beautiful young Shunammite woman named Abishag to be his bed warmer, and she's described as beautiful. And there are some others down here, but I just want to note the Proverbs element that suggests Abigail's beauty without her cleverness is like a gold ring and a pig's snout, or what we might say putting lipstick on a pig, but it just shows it's an old saying, decorating a pig that is like a beautiful woman without good sense. So we see all of those there. So as we move on to the description of Nabal here, we hear two words to describe him here, and surly and mean is what the New RSV has, but let's look more closely at that. Kasha vera malalim vehu halavo, hard and evil of practices or deeds and of heart. So highlighting, these are not just abstract characteristics, it's his practices. He's a hard taskmaster and hard of heart. Recalling 2010, let's look back at that, where David said to Jonathan, who will tell me if your father answers you harshly, using Quashash, like Pharaoh and like Nabal, and also like the sons of Zeruiah, as we'll see later. So highlighting the element that Nabal may well be understood as a stand-in for Saul here. So hard of heart and mean of practice, the heart of heart certainly echoes Pharaoh, as we see in my note down below. And then he was described as a Calebite. And Falkeman notes that perhaps anticipating Abner's question at 2 Samuel 3:8, let's look at that here. Am I a dog's head for Judah? Highlighting that the word for dog is Caleb, and so maybe that's anticipating that there. But also acknowledging that David said to Saul in chapter 24, am I like a dead dog or a single flea that you're pursuing me here? Falkeman notes it indicates he's a Judean, not a Judean like David, if we think of that as a tribal expression. But as Samura notes, could also be like Nabal, a character feature, that he's like a dog. And that's a view of Ellen von Wolde, too, who argues against the tribal ID based on 3 points. This is the only such use in the Hebrew Bible of this term Calebite in this form. Elsewhere, Nabal is called a Carmelite, as expressing the place that he's from, and markers that express ethnic identity are usually in the form of the blank. So, so-and-so, the Calebite, rather than a Calebite. So that's suggesting that our character is introduced here as a mean dog. And as some have suggested, that could even mean like an SOC rather than SOB, substituting the dog word bitch for the dog word cur here. And yet an argument has been made about other things related to it that will relate to the rest of our story, but I'll stop for there because that's enough for our introduction. Because with that introduction, David heard that Nabal was in the wilderness, and off he sends his men for whatever it is he's doing, and we'll find out what that is next time. See you then.